Hello and welcome to Oracle PLSQL video tutorial series. In this video, we'll discuss cursors. When select statement is run, the resultant rows are loaded in the memory. Oracle allocates an area of memory to these resultant rows. A cursor is a reference to this area in memory. As a result of a normal SQL statement, the reference to the resultant rows or the area of that memory is called an implicit cursor. We have little programming control over implicit cursor. You can view some information of the most recent implicit cursors, however. For example, SQL %found returns true if most recent SQL statement affects some rows. Other examples are %not found, %is open, %row count. To create an explicit cursor, we use an SQL statement in the declaration section of the block. Cursor name, then is keyword. In the executable part of the block, we open the cursor, open keyword, and then cursor name. Then we assign the contents of the cursor to variable using fetch into keywords. The columns in the cursor and variables after fetch into clause must match both in terms of numbers and data type and sizes, and of course they should be in the same order. Fetch into clause also moves cursor to the next row. We close this cursor by using close cursor name. In this demo, we are declaring a cursor CEMP based on first name and last name columns of employees table in HR schema. We are declaring two variables of variable character data type. In executable part, we are opening this cursor, and then in a loop we are using fetch into clause to assign the contents of the columns first name and last name to those two variables. Then we'll exit the loop when there will be no row left by using %not found after cursor name. We are printing these two variables values on screen. After the loop, we'll close the cursor. So let's run this script, and we can see the first name and last name are printed. We can pass parameters to a cursor. In the declaration section, we define parameter name in the parentheses, and when we open them in executable part, we provide values. We can also set a default value for parameter. So if default value is set, when we open a cursor without providing the value to the parameterized cursor, it will use the default value we set in the default clause. When we provide a value to such cursor, the provided value will override the default value. Here we'll provide a parameter to the cursor, and here we are providing parameter vdepth, and in query, in the where clause, we'll use this parameter to restrict our query to the input department number when we open the cursor. Now in open cursor clause, we'll pass value 10 as parameter, and this will restrict the cursor to fetch only department ID 10 rows. So in the input area, we can see rows are restricted to the records that have department ID 10. Now change it to 20, and we can see that it will fetch records with department ID 20. Now we are setting a default parameter value, in this case 10. So if in case of not providing any value, the records with department ID 10 will be fetched. Now we won't provide any value and only department 10 rows are fetched. Now provide value 20 and we can see that the default value is overridden by 10. Cursor for loops are another way to fetch and process every record in a cursor. It simplifies the process and does most of the tasks implicitly, like opening and closing the cursor. So we don't need to open and close the cursors. In the executable part, instead of fetch into clause, use for and then cursor index. You can provide any name to cursor index and will prefix it with the cursor column name to use as a reference. We can also use parameterized cursor in cursor for loop. Here we are using cursor for loop to print out the first name and last name from the employees table as we did before. But here we can see that the same task is much simplified. We are using cursor index EMPREC with cursor column name to process its value. Let's execute it and we can see that we printed the cursor values. Here we are using a parameterized cursor with cursor for loop. We can pass the value in cursor for loop. Here we are passing 10 as parameter value. Let's run this script and here is the output.